In many ancient stories and psychological traditions, there is a character who appears again and again, the fool. At first glance, the fool seems harmless, naive, trusting, perhaps even a little foolish. In myth and symbolism, the fool often begins the journey at the very start of life's path. The fool walks forward with curiosity and openness, unaware of the dangers that may lie ahead. Carl Jung believed that archetypes like the fool live deep within the human psyche. They are universal patterns of behavior that people unconsciously step into throughout their lives. And while the fool can represent innocence and the beginning of transformation, there is another side to this archetype. A side that appears when a person continues trusting situations that repeatedly reveal themselves to be harmful. When someone ignores patterns that have already shown their true nature. When someone continues to hope for change long after reality has made itself clear. In this form, the fool is not simply innocent. The fool is unaware. And many people, at some point in their lives, discover they have been playing this role, often without realizing it. For many women, this realization arrives quietly, not all at once, but slowly, through a series of moments that begin to reveal something uncomfortable. She begins to notice patterns she once ignored. She notices how often she explains herself, how often she gives the benefit of the doubt, how often she tolerates behavior that leaves her feeling smaller than she truly is. And eventually, a deeper awareness begins to form. Perhaps she has been playing the fool. This realization can be difficult because many women do not step into this role out of weakness. They do it out of compassion. They believe in people. They believe in second chances. They believe that patience and understanding will eventually lead to growth. And in many situations, those qualities are admirable. But Jung believed that psychological growth requires something deeper than compassion alone. It requires awareness. Awareness of our own patterns. Awareness of the roles we unconsciously play. And awareness of the moments when those roles begin to work against our own well-being. The fool archetype often appears in relationships. It shows up when someone repeatedly excuses behavior that their intuition already recognizes as a pattern. It appears when someone explains away disrespect as misunderstanding. When broken promises are interpreted as temporary mistakes. When someone continues to give loyalty to situations that have stopped offering respect in return. The fool hopes. The fool waits. The fool believes that if they are patient enough, kind enough, or understanding enough, things will eventually change. But eventually, reality begins to break through the illusion, and this is often where the transformation begins. Because the fool archetype is not meant to be permanent. In many symbolic journeys, the fool begins the story unaware. But the journey transforms them. Experience reveals patterns. Disappointment reveals truth. And slowly, innocence evolves into wisdom. For many women, this moment arrives when they begin asking a different question. Not, why do people keep treating me this way? But, why have I continued accepting this pattern? This shift in perspective is powerful, because it places awareness back where it belongs, within the self. And with that awareness, something begins to change. The woman who stops playing the fool begins to see situations more clearly. She recognizes manipulation where she once saw confusion. She recognizes indifference where she once saw temporary distance. She recognizes repeated patterns that she once interpreted as isolated events. And once those patterns become visible, it becomes much harder to ignore them. This is where psychological maturity begins to take shape. because Jung believed that true development requires the integration of both compassion and strength. A woman who stops playing the fool does not lose her kindness, but she begins pairing it with discernment. In relationships, this transformation often becomes visible through subtle changes in behavior. She stops explaining her boundaries repeatedly. She stops trying to convince someone to treat her well. She stops chasing clarity from people who benefit from confusion. Instead, she begins paying closer attention to actions rather than words. She trusts patterns more than promises. She allows behavior to reveal the truth of a situation. And perhaps most importantly, she begins trusting her own perception. Because one of the most common traits of the fool archetype is self-doubt. The fool often ignores their intuition in order to maintain harmony. But the awakened woman learns to listen to that inner voice again. She allows herself to acknowledge what she sees. She allows herself to recognize when something feels wrong, and she no longer dismisses those signals in order to preserve the comfort of others. Carl Jung believed that this process is part of individuation, the gradual movement toward becoming one's authentic self. Individuation requires shedding identities and roles that no longer support our growth. And for many women, the role of the fool is one of those identities. The woman who stops playing the fool begins to move through the world differently. She becomes more selective with her energy, more thoughtful about where she invests her trust, more confident in her ability to recognize truth. She still values compassion, but she no longer confuses compassion with self-sacrifice. She still believes in growth, but she understands that growth must be mutual. She no longer feels responsible for fixing people who refuse to change. And because of this clarity, something remarkable begins to happen. Her relationships begin to change. Some people will respect the new boundaries she creates. Others may feel uncomfortable with them. But the woman who has moved beyond the fool archetype no longer fears that discomfort, because she understands something that the fool once ignored. Respect is not created by endless patience. It is created by self-respect. Carl Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are requires confronting uncomfortable truths. It requires recognizing patterns we once overlooked, and it requires releasing roles that once felt familiar but no longer serve our growth. For many women, one of the most powerful moments of that journey arrives when they stop playing the fool. Not because they have become hardened, not because they no longer care, but because their awareness has deepened. They see more clearly, they trust themselves more fully, and they understand that kindness should never require the abandonment of one's own dignity. The fool may begin the journey, but wisdom is what completes it, and the woman who embraces that wisdom is no longer the fool in someone else's story. She becomes the author of her own, and perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden within the fool archetype. The fool begins the journey unaware, trusting, open, hopeful. But life slowly reveals the patterns that shape our experiences, and through those patterns, awareness grows. In Jungian psychology, wisdom is not the loss of innocence. It is the transformation of innocence into understanding. The woman who stops playing the fool does not lose her compassion. She simply learns where compassion belongs. She learns that kindness should never require the abandonment of self-respect. She learns that trust must be matched with consistency. And she learns that awareness is the foundation of freedom. Carl Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are requires the courage to recognize the roles you have unconsciously played. And sometimes, the most powerful transformation begins the moment you step out of the role of the fool, not because you have become hardened, but because you have become aware. Aware of your worth, aware of your intuition, aware of the patterns that once held you back. And from that awareness, something remarkable happens. You begin to live not as the fool in someone else's story, but as the conscious author of your own. And if you enjoy exploring the psychology of awakening, self-discovery, and the ideas of Carl Jung, consider subscribing for more reflections on the journey of becoming who you truly are. Because sometimes the most powerful transformation in life begins with a single moment of awareness.